And here is our last lesson of Unit 6 entitled Arts and Society, Lesson 29. So our teaks, we're going to learn about a man named Henry David Thoreau and how his refusal to pay his taxes to the U.S. was an example of civil disobedience. And we're going to analyze the reasons why people practice civil disobedience. That we can analyze the contributions to the national identity of artists and writers from different groups, that we can describe developments in art, music, and literature in the U.S. in the 1800s. We can identify examples of that art and how it reflects 1800s society. And finally, that we can analyze how arts reflect the idea of stability and change in American life. So let's move ahead. Artists see changes. Two important movements of the 1800s. One of these was the Enlightenment, and we've actually discussed the Enlightenment before, going back to as far as the 1600s. Enlightenment thinkers and writers were a big influence on the founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration of Independence. But the Enlightenment taught that human intelligence and reason would be able to solve problems, and in some ways was a rejection of the church and the organized religion of the medieval times. And from the Enlightenment, this belief in human intelligence, we get the Industrial Revolution with its scientific discoveries and inventions and technology, and the belief that these will make for a better future. So the question is, how would artists and writers react to this changing world around them? Well, what we get is a reaction to this called Romanticism. Now, we think of that word romantic as meaning love or affection between people, but romantic also has another meaning, meaning to feel strong emotion. So Romanticism was a movement of artists and writers beginning in the early 1800s that were reacting to the changing world and industrialization of the world both here and in Europe. So let's compare the industrial world to the ideas of Romanticism. The industrial world follows the ideas of the scientific revolution that human nature is rational and that the intellect, the mind, and the ideas are most important. Whereas Romanticism embraces emotion. It says that human nature is passionate and emotion is more important than intellect. The industrial world says that nature can be used to serve man. And we see examples how coal and wood are used to burn steam engines and run steam-powered machines. Whereas Romanticism says that nature must be preserved and not interfered with. The industrial world says that science will solve our problems, whereas Romanticism finds science possibly dangerous and unpredictable, dealing with things we don't know how to control. The industrial world embraces traditional religion and being part of an organized religion. Romanticism says that personal spirituality and being true to oneself is more important than being part of an organized church. The industrial world looked to the future, whereas Romanticism was inspired by the past. So artists in nature. One of the important groups of this time is the Hudson River School, which practiced in the Hudson River Valley of New York. This was a group of American landscape artists. They painted vast wilderness scenes. Here we see an example of a Hudson River School painting. When they put people in them at all, the people tended to be very small in comparison to the vastness and overwhelming majesty and power of nature. So here we see again this example, bright colors, very deep, deep scenes with lots of landscape and lots of sky. They also did portraits of the American West. As America moved west, the Hudson River School went with them, painting the Great Plains, the deserts of the Southwest, the Rocky Mountains, all the way out to the Pacific coast. Let me get John James Audubon, who came from France and immigrated to the U.S. He did detailed studies of American birds, and he painted these almost photorealistic portraits of them. And in many ways, many of these species that he painted are now extinct, so Audubon's pictures of them are the only real records we have of their existence. His paintings were very beautiful and very detailed, and many of them still exist today. And in fact, from him we get the Audubon Society, an important naturalist group, and they have several zoos, such as the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans. Then we have Gilbert Stuart, who is an American portrait artist. He is best known for his portrait of George Washington, and you may recognize it. This is the portrait of Washington that's on our $1 bill. However, we might not have this portrait had it been destroyed because it was rescued from the White House when the White House was burned in the War of 1812. Remember we talked about how the British invaded Washington, D.C., and they burned the White House? where Dolly Madison and her servants helped rescue this and several other works of art from the White House before they could be destroyed. So that's why we have this painting. Another artist was George Catlin, and he painted Native American portraits and scenes. And then, of course, we have folk art made by just regular old folks, settlers, and slaves using local materials. So here we see an example of a U.S. flag, probably made by a settler. And here we see what looks like a jug that was most likely made by an African American slave. Then American literature. The American writers wanted to create a unique style that separated them as American writers from European writers. So some examples of this were James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans, which was based on life in the American wilderness. And this was something that Americans had that was unique from European writers, was their beginnings and their foundations as a frontier nation. Another important writer was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote long epic poems about America's past. Two of them were The Song of Hiawatha, also with Native American themes, and Paul Revere's Ride, the famous story, Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Then we have American Romantic literature. We have poetry, and poets experimented with language in different ways. Two of the most famous were Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And of course, there's Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote short stories, many of them horror or mystery novels. You probably read some Poe, perhaps in your English classes or maybe on your own. He's well known for his famous poem, The Raven, and the stories The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and a number of his other stories of murder and horror are very familiar to us. Then we get the novels with themes of love, revenge, destruction, very passionate, people driven by their passions, in some cases driven to their doom by their passions. One example here is The Scarlet Letter. And then we have Herman Melville, Moby Dick, about a sea captain, Captain Ahab, who's obsessed with destroying a white whale who bit off his leg and destroys himself and his ship in the process. Again, people driven by their emotions. Finally, we have a new philosophy called transcendentalism. The transcendentalists believe that people could transcend, which means to go beyond the physical world. They wanted to find truth inside your own spirit, to not look for it in church or religion or in the outside world, but within oneself. They were also inspired by the beauty of nature, like we saw with other artists. And they wanted to believe that you should follow your own feelings and your own conscience, even if that went against the written law. So the idea of following your own feelings and conscience in violation of the law, that's what you believe you should do, resulted in this idea of civil disobedience, which we'll talk about in a moment. The leader of the Transcendentalists was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was a Transcendentalist writer, and his most famous student was Henry David Thoreau. Now, I mentioned about civil disobedience. Thoreau disagreed with the U.S. involvement with the Mexican War, which we'll talk about in our next unit here. And as a result, he refused to pay his taxes to the government as protest to this war, and he was put in jail for that. So this is an example of civil disobedience, a term we want to learn here. And that means to refuse to obey an unjust law. Earlier on, we mentioned the example of Martin Luther King, who was often put in jail for his refusal to obey what he considered to be unjust practices against the civil rights of African Americans. Another famous example of that is Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on the bus in defying what she considered an unjust law, and Mahatma Gandhi, who defied British rule of India using civil disobedience as well. In a previous example we've talked about this year, the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty boarded that in protest for the Tea Act and destroyed over $1 million of tea as an act of civil disobedience. So our Lesson 29 thoughts. One, that we can summarize the main characteristics of artistic Romanticism and how it was a reaction to the changing world of the 1800s, how the Romantics reacted against the industrial world to embrace emotion and artistic freedom and nature. And number two, what common characteristics do you see when comparing transcendentalism to the First and Second Great Awakenings, and what differences do you see? So like I said, that concludes Unit 6, and when we come back, our next unit, Unit 7, we're going to be heading west in Manifest Destiny, and we'll see you then.